on the weekend, I had my birthday, and my wife took me to Detroit. I really like Detroit because I think the architecture in Detroit is really fascinating. The buildings are fascinating. I like downtown Detroit. We saw 2 concerts in back-to-back nights at a place called the Masonic Temple in Detroit. Has anybody ever been to the Masonic Temple in Detroit? Jeff has. I know Jeff has because he'd go see the same sort of concerts I go to that are in Detroit. You go to the Masonic Temple, and what the Masonic Temple is like, it's a even grander version of what you'd see at Massey Hall in Toronto. It's bigger. And in fact, when doing some reading on it, it actually has the largest stage in North America in a theater. And you think about it, this is not that surprising. Detroit, at the time it was built in the 1920s, was sort of one of the great cities of the world. It had auto money. It was a fascinating place, great architecture. You wander around downtown, you see spectacular buildings. And the building is relatively intact. It's restored. It's got the ornate painting on the ceiling. If you look up, it's really quite something. And just a little while ago, I think this goes back 6 or 7 years ago, that building had almost disappeared. Back taxes to the county of $150,000, couldn't pay them, and the building was just going to be closed, and knowing the history of Detroit, it would probably just disappear. Interestingly, the musician Jack White put up the money because his mother had worked as an usher there, so he paid their tax bill, and this spectacular venue still exists. What does that have to do with Stanley Thompson? One of the things that everybody here has talked a little bit about is about this legacy and this history of Thompson golf courses. And I'll preface this by telling a brief anecdote of how I got to what we're going to discuss. In December, Lauren Rubenstein said, "Hey, can you give me a call? I want to talk to you about something." I hadn't talked to Lauren in a while, and so I called, and he said, "I've been approached about becoming an expert witness about a golf course. I don't have time or the inclination to do it. Would you like to take it on? It's a Stanley Thompson golf course in Menaki, Ontario." Does anybody here know where Menaki, Ontario is? Show of hands. Come on. Who knows where? So just to be clear on where Menaki, Ontario is, you fly to Winnipeg, you drive 3 hours east, and you head 40 minutes north of Kenora. That's where Menaki, Ontario is. It's actually essentially a place where, for Winnipeg, it's sort of a Lake of the Woods area, so it's essentially like a holiday summer destination. And in Menaki, Ontario, Stanley Thompson built a 9-hole golf course. And I have spent the last 5 months studying all the nuances of Menaki, a 9-hole golf course that hasn't actually existed since 2003. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about Menaki, and then I want to talk about, sort of pose the bigger question of when you look at Thompson's heritage and what we'd say is a Stanley Thompson golf course, or what is a significant part of a Stanley Thompson golf course. Or as Ian was saying over dinner, if you had 10 Stanley Thompson golf courses and you wanted to bring somebody who hadn't seen them, what parts would you show them and what were important? I want to think about what is a Stanley Thompson golf course and one of those keys that we'd go to see and we want to retain and we want to keep. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit in the context of Menaki. This is the Menaki Lodge golf course. So the Lodge, just to give you a little bit of the backstory here, the Lodge, which is quite spectacular, was built in the early 1920s, promptly burned to the ground. This becomes a theme in Menaki. At the same time, 1924, Stanley Thompson, in and around 1923, 1924, 1925, Thompson has almost 30 golf courses in varying stages of construction or opening. 30 golf courses in that period of time, and they range from as far south is Ohio and as far west is Regina. So you think about it, it's a massive operation. It's got all these different golf courses on the go. And in the middle of all of this is Menaki, which was a CNR project done right around the same time as Jasper Park Lodge. So he's hired to do Jasper Park Lodge with a very large budget, a very large piece of property. And I think at the same time, CNR said, "Oh, by the way, we want you to build a golf course at this lodge we've just built. It's only 40 acres, and we're not going to give you this much of a budget, but go to it." So the question about Menaki then is, over the years, what I've been asked to do is sort of a report on this, and I wrote 5,500 words on this, was to look at Menaki as a golf course and look at what's actually there, what's significant, what would be retained or what is worth retaining over a period of time. And there's varying opinions on this. Stanley Thompson Society had issued a one-page letter on it. The architect Les Ferber has issued a couple of pages on this. Kirsten Brown, who did a lot of research to Stanley Thompson Society, has done a very lengthy piece on this. There's another heritage architect, so it's much debated. The essence of the debate is that Moonachie Golf Club hasn't operated since 2003. So the lodge, and I'll show you a great photo of this, the lodge burns down again in 2002. And at that point, the golf course operates for a summer. Basically, the season is July and August. It's 9 holes. The population of Moonachie, Ontario, anyone? Take a guess. 80. The population of Moonachie, Ontario is 80 people. So without the resort, it's hard to run a golf course when you got 80 people. And by the way, that's 80 people within 40 minutes. The next largest town of any note is Kenora, which is a population of about 15,000. So what you see here is kind of neat, though. Thompson had a small piece of property. If you look at this, so the lodge is kind of in here. That's the first hole, the second hole, the third hole, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. Runs back to the clubhouse. It operated this way. It was short, it was sporty, it was very tight, pretty well treed, and by all accounts, when he built it, it had almost no topsoil. They imported it all by train. However, over the ensuing period of time, this golf course has seen dramatic change. So what you see below is the first of the 9th greens. 9th green opens that way. It's rebuilt again 2 years later. And then many years later, when they put another building in, it becomes this. So if you're today, there's a tee about here, and you hit up into this section there. You look at this and say, well, there's no golf course there. Yes, there isn't a golf course there. It hasn't operated in more than 10 years. So the hole has changed quite dramatically. And as I say, there's the original 9th green site. There's the second 9th green site. Now this, I'll admit, was a pretty spectacular spot. The lodge, you can see the green, the original green played right into the sort of hub of the lodge. And then what happened was they built a pretty elaborate roadway, which you see up in here, and they moved the green quite significantly. Today, just by comparison, the green is right here. So you hit kind of across this bay, and the green is right there. There's the 3rd green site. So that sort of brings you up now. The interesting thing about Moonachie is they've asked me to kind of look at it in the perspective of what is significant in Stanley Thompson's career that's at Moonachie. Frankly, I really struggled with that. And I think if we're honest, not every Thompson golf course is of equal value to every other Thompson golf course. This is a minor work in Thompson's career that I believe he probably took because the commission was hard to turn down. You've been offered Jasper, you've been offered an unlimited budget basically, and oh, by the way, you're gonna do this other golf course. It only makes sense to me as a writer or as an artist that you would think, I have 2 commissions. One on a very large piece of property with a large budget on a spectacular piece of ground. I also have this other one with the smaller budget on a much more difficult piece of property. You would probably put time into Jasper and less time into Moonachie, especially if you had 10 golf courses on the go at the same time. That's the fire at the Moonachie Lodge. So there's a whole variety of stories of what happened at the Moonachie Lodge, but by the time we get to 2000, the golf course is closed at varying points. It's been closed up to 3 times in its history. It just stopped operating. The lodge was deemed a historic site. It's quite a spectacular spot. It's right on the Winnipeg River. It's quite dramatic. In the off season of 2001, I think, nobody's there. It burns to the ground. As you can gather in a small town, there's a variety of discussion about why a historic building burns to the ground in 2001 that's hemorrhaging money. The interesting thing I'll add to that, without drawing any conclusions on it, there was no insurance on the property. Property burns to the ground, the guy goes bankrupt, property is put up for sale. What happens is that the owner buys the property, and then another owner, then it goes for sale again, another owner buys it. In this time, the golf course has operated for 1 season in the last 16 years. There currently is a debate about whether this golf course is historically significant. whether it more specifically should be characterized as a heritage landscape. In Ontario, there are 2 golf courses that are heritage landscapes. Other than Jeff Mingay, can anybody name them?
Roseland.
Roseland in Windsor. Anybody have any guesses what the second one is?
Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Nope, but that'd be, I would have guessed that one too. That's a good call.
great.
Anybody have any other thoughts? Close to here.
St. George's.
Lakeview. So in order for a golf course to be made a heritage landscape, basically the municipality applies for it. They make it, and golf courses fit the definition. So a golf course can be a heritage landscape, and I actually fully agree with that. I think there are golf courses. Niagara's a good example that should be heritage landscapes. We should protect these. I just don't think Moonachie is the one. So the question of Moonachie comes down to a bunch of factors of what makes the Stanley Thompson golf course important, significant, or interesting. So the photo on the left is from the opening of Moonachie. Photo on the right, depending on which way you're looking at, is obviously Banff Springs. These are only a few years apart, but they're actually hugely significant. About 15 or 16 years ago, on eBay, when people weren't paying attention to these things, I bought a set of photos for Jasper Park Lodge that turned out to be from the opening. The only thing is, when Ian and I looked at them, they weren't reflective of the Jasper Park Lodge we saw. The bunkering was more like this, kind of low profile, kind of underwhelming, more like what Moonachie was, which makes sense because Moonachie and Jasper Park are done essentially the same time. What we later find out is that Thompson, after doing the elaborate bunkering you see at Banff, was asked by the competing railway to go back and make Jasper look like Banff. So lost in this is this early stage of what you see with Moonachie, which is fairly low profile, not particularly exciting, and that's basically what the bunkering looked like up until the golf course disappeared. So I'd say if you're talking about aesthetics at Moonachie, it's not what, if somebody came and said, show me the best of Stanley Thompson. We're actually talking about this with Graham Hudson at dinner today. If I said to Graham, I'm going to take you and show you some great stuff so you have a sense of what other properties around the time of Highlands Links were done, I'd go up the street and I'd look at St. George's. And we talked about this. You might go to see an early property, you might go see Thornhill, you might go see the work at Cumming and Thompson at Summit. There's a variety of properties. I'm not sure aesthetically Moonachie is particularly spectacular. In fact, I flew to Winnipeg, drove the 3 hours, drove up there about a month ago, and walked around the property, which is basically a field, but you still see where the bunkers were. The golf course is still largely intact. It's overgrown, but it's not awful. It's kind of underwhelming, to be honest. I've flown 4 hours to get there and then driven another 3 hours. And I'm like, I'm here for this. So, second thing I'd say about Moonachie is this is a very small piece of property. Thompson talked a lot about in his philosophy, which he published but then broke right, left, and center. He talks about sites and size of sites. This is a very small, tight site. And I want you to note a couple of things about it. So you see this strip in here? That's a road. And now that's the main entrance road into the Moonachie Lodge, which is all back in here. This is the third tee. So you actually hit basically parallel to the road coming in. This gets a little more complicated because that's the seventh green, and this is not a very long hole. And if you push the ball a little to the right, you could quite readily hit it into the guys who are putting it out on the seventh green. So you got a potential roadway issue. Right now, there's actually a marshy pond with trees growing out of it, which they sort of structured in between, and you got this green that's in play. In the 1920s, when you were maybe playing early steel shafts, or you're still playing hickories, you'd never hit that green. I'll tell you, having played Mississauga today with an epic driver, I could block one onto that, no problem. In fact, I probably do, I would do my best to block it in there. It wouldn't have to take much of a mistake to get it there. So there's that in question. But the routing was relatively, he didn't have a lot to work with here. The property is okay. It's not a spectacular piece of property. It's set aside for this opening hole, which runs up to this green side, which is really quite something. Even today, it's quite an interesting hole. but then it has a roadway that runs through it just as landing area, which is far from ideal, obviously. But, on the other hand, lots of golf courses have it. So then you see 2, 3, and you see the rest of the routing. This is largely still intact with the exception of the 9th hole, which is completely different than it was. But I want you to compare that with, so there's just the example of what the routing looks like, where all the holes are. So compare that with that, which is, arguably, you could make an argument for Capilano, you could make an argument that Highlands Links is his greatest routing. What you get at Menaki is a fairly plain routing. It's not sophisticated. It uses the land fairly well. There's no holes on it that are particularly, by the way, the holes, nothing is over 400 yards. There's a couple of short ones. It was always like a 2,700 yard golf course at its peak. So I'd say that as a routing, it's not spectacular either. So what I want you to sort of walk away from when you're talking about this or when you're thinking about this is then, so if I say Menaki isn't a great example of a Stanley Thompson golf course, if this doesn't meet the definition of a heritage property, then what are the golf courses that do meet that definition? What are the golf courses that are significant that we should consider? And you start getting back to it, and Jeff really hinted at this. Start thinking about it. So you readily go, St. George's up the road. How much of St. George's to this room actually is intact to Stanley Thompson's vision? None of the greens. The bunkers have been put back largely in place, but not entirely, right?
Yeah, probably 20 short.
Right, so close. Routing's changed, holes have changed. So in Menaki, I'm just going to go back, I want to show you the other thing, the interesting. So if this is the routing, it turns out that the 3rd hole isn't actually on the property that the developer owns. So this is all owned by the railway. The 1st hole has already been severed off and sold, and the 9th hole is completely different. So 30% of this golf course in like that, I can say, has nothing to do with Stanley Thompson anymore, or cannot ever be put back to the way it was. Part of it's a parking lot, part of it's not on property they own. So let's roll through them. If you went through the big 5, Westmount, which isn't part of them, but which I'm very fond of as a golf course, has a numerous, how many holes by Robbie?
3.
So 3 holes that are completely have nothing to do with Stanley Thompson.
5, 6, 7.
Yeah, where the range is now is where the old Thompson holes were. Capilano, largely intact. Some greens have been rebuilt. Pretty good example, I would say, of what if I were to say, let's put up a Stanley Thompson golf course and say this is a good example of his work. This deserves to be protected. I think Capilano's genius. So you completely get me on that one.
Lots of greens rebuilt.
Lots of greens rebuilt, but the routing is still the thing there, and it's intact, right? Banff, obviously there's been significant work done at Banff over time. The routing, there are holes, obviously there's a hole that has nothing to do with Thompson. And the routing is reconfigured because of the ridiculous clubhouse / space shuttle or whatever it is in the middle.
If you don't know, the opener on the tunnel line is actually is the original hole, and the opening hole on the current 18 you play is actually is a Bill Robinson.
Bill Robinson design, yeah.
Every green's been rebuilt.
Every green's been rebuilt. So then you come to Jasper Park Lodge, which actually is relatively intact. It's once again, is pretty much as close as you're going to get. There have been stuff that's changed, some greens rebuilt, but it's pretty close. Routing is still intact.
Where are the greens?
I was told USGA spec on a couple of them, right?
Well, the fourth par 3 was excavated and redone in sand.
Okay, and I think actually 8 has as well. That
Yeah,
you're talking about that. But it's the same contours.
3 of the 18 that were excavated,
Yeah.
and it was part of a long-range plan that never got fulfilled.
So, I think at this point it's splitting hairs. It's largely, compared to something like Menaki, vastly, A, world-class, recognized as world-class, and largely intact. And then Graham's place down in the corner has 1 green rebuilt, Graham? 1 green rebuilt. Ian did the best he could to put all the bunkers back. The routing is exactly the way it was. The holes play basically the way they're intended. You got an irrigation system, which is unfortunate, but you needed one of those. I think if you started picking through Thompson golf courses, you were going to say, let's put this forward Stanley Thompson is a person of national historic significance, and I think that's important, and I think his best work needs to be regarded that way. I don't think Menacke's it, clearly, but I do think there are examples that we should take forward, that this should be an initiative people, but careful what you wish for. When we talked about doing this with Highlands Links a number of years ago, before Ian had done the bunkering, basically when you do it, it's difficult to do continued work on the property afterwards because you're basically setting a point in time saying, this is what we're restoring it to, this is what we're going to try to maintain. Clearly though, Roseland has continued to do work, and I don't know whether they got the designation before or after they did that most recent, was it before? But I think part of the intent was to actually try to return it in some. So, you know, when we go around talking about Stanley Thompson Golf Course, we talk about bunkers, we talk about routing, we talk about creativity, we talk about fun, but it turns out that in a vast majority of these, a lot of those things that we relate to Stanley Thompson aren't actually Stanley Thompson. And there are only a handful of golf courses where this is the case. And that's, you know, it's hard to imagine I wrote 5,500 words on a 2,700 yard 9-hole golf course in the middle of nowhere in Northern Ontario. But when I went through it, you recognize that Thompson had great artistry, but he was also a businessman. And he was doing a lot of projects. And not every project was equal to other projects. For example, Ian's done work at Kawartha. Kawartha, he had a big client in GE, and he didn't have a lot of other work, so he spent a lot of time there. Menacke comes in the middle of a ton of work, isn't a good property, difficult spot to get to even though it was on the railway line, and he had other more high-profile projects. I think what we're talking about when we talk about what the most significant Thompson designs are, and what the ones we should talk about as a heritage designation, are the ones you'd want to bring people to and say, this is what the artistry of Stanley Thompson is about. But there simply aren't that many of them there anymore. And maybe now is the time we take this into consideration and look at these properties like Jasper, like Highlands Links, and say, yeah, these deserve to be recognized for the artistry of not only creating a playing field, but just the artistry of what they bring to the landscape. And you know, I'm hopeful that we'll start getting there. I find it frustrating that we're debating, you know, this lot of debate spent over a 9-hole golf course that I don't think ever matched up to his best work. But it's time we start looking at what his best work is and consider that. And it's an organization like the Stanley Thompson Society with the right properties could probably have some sway in this, because this is a municipal issue. And you know, it's only in recent years that golf courses have fit the definition of a heritage landscape. And I do think it's important. So that's a little bit about Menacke Golf Club. Which was interesting to go to. It's always interesting to go see a new golf course when it's first built, and this was interesting because I wandered around a field of a golf course that hasn't been played in 14 years, which is also quite intriguing. But thank you everybody for your time. Thank you to the rest of the speakers. Thank you to Lauren and Jeff and Ian. Thank you Stanley Thompson Society for doing this. Thanks for Gary for hosting. I guess we'll take a few questions, and if there are no questions, we'll hang out for a beer and chat that way. But thank you all for your time and your patience.